We're back, and I'm very pleased to say we're joined by Lawrence Peck. He is one of our country's foremost experts on something that you might find incredible. That is to say, that there are people in our country who are in favor of one of the most horrific governments on the planet, that of North Korea. Lawrence has studied closely the influence operators of the United Front Department of North Korea and their handiwork here in the United States. We're going to be talking about a prime example of it and something that's particularly worrying because it is very likely to have exactly the opposite of its purported purpose. Lawrence is, among other things, an advisor to a terrific organization, the North Korean Freedom Council. I'm glad to have him with us. And Lawrence, it's good to have you back. It's been too long, so thank you for taking the time to join us today.
I appreciate being with you today again, Frank.
My pleasure. Let me ask you, first of all, about this legislation, Lawrence. We'll talk more about how it's come to pass, but you've written in Town Hall a piece about whether your representatives are being influenced by extremists on behalf of a bill that would, well, make concessions to North Korea. And I'm interested in this legislation, H.R. 3446, so-called Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act. Tell us what it's about and why it is purportedly going to conduce to peace on that long divided peninsula.
H.R. 3446, which was introduced by Congressman Brad Sherman of out here in California, and which has now been co-sponsored by about 30 other members of Congress, all Democrats, with the exception of one lone Republican. The Democrats sponsoring it are of those we might call the usual suspects, people like Tlaib and Omar, Barbara Lee out in California, Schakowsky of Illinois, the hardcore so-called progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and it is called the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, but I believe it would probably be more accurately named something such as the Unreciprocated Concessions to North Korea Act or the Undeserved Gift Dream Come True for Kim Jong Un Act.
Yeah, or possibly just the precursor to war, the Korean War 2.0 Act. We'll can talk about which of those might be most apt, but what specifically is this legislation intended to encourage or promote?
What H.R. 3446 quite dangerously and harmfully to our national security interests and to the cause of freedom in Asia does is call on our government, instructs our government to uh, enter into negotiations for a so-called peace agreement, which would include within it an end of war declaration with North Korea without precondition to end the current travel ban on U.S. citizens to North Korea, which, as you know, has resulted in the killing and torture of Americans who had been there, not only Otto Warmbier, but a number of Korean American individuals who were in similar situations, although not being murdered by the North, being tortured there. And also, it instructs the U.S. to review the opening of a liaison office in the North, a kind of low-level form of quasi-diplomatic relations. So it's basically opposing some of the current sanction regime we have on the North, and to sign a what they refer to as a kind of a peace agreement, which would formally end the Korean War, which was terminated by an armistice agreement at the end of the war in 1953.
This is a point on which I think most of us would be a little confused. The armistice putatively ended that war, and yet we're told that absent some sort of peace agreement, there won't be formally an end to those long ago suspended hostilities. I shouldn't say completely suspended. The North has engaged periodically in violent acts against the South or against even U.S. personnel on the DMZ. So, Lawrence, talk a little bit about this legal uh, situation. Why is it that a peace agreement is deemed to be necessary, at least by those who are proponents of this HR 3446 legislation?
Well, the forces backing it, both in South Korea and here in the US, uh, are pursuing it in order to use it to get a foot in the door for an expansion of relations with North Korea, for an end to sanctions on the North, to basically cement the policy goals of the current left wing South Korean administration of Moon Jae in, and to make it possible for a full panoply of appeasement policies to be set in motion, as we had tried umpteen times in the past.
And to the extent that we have experimented with varying agreements, undertakings, understandings, promises from North Korea, how have they performed with respect to their promises?
Well, that's one of the most disturbing things about this bill, which is that it requires and doesn't even mention any of the prerequisites which you would expect a U.S. government to demand, even request. From the North, such as their denuclearization, such as an end to their violent acts up on the DMZ and on the seas around the Korean Peninsula, an end to their assassinations of people overseas, of their various illegal activities from cyber warfare and hacking to illicit trade all around the world, and to the shipping of and the technical assistance regarding weapons of mass destruction to rogue nations in the Middle East, such as Iran and Syria. But the bill makes no mention of that, not to mention not making any reference to the horrific human rights abuses, the crimes against humanity, which North Korea has been documented of committing. It's basically a giveaway to the North.
And I guess this is one of those things that in the intelligence business would be described as a clue about the provenance of this legislation. Uh, Before we again get into some of the particulars, there is something in the North Korean government known as the United Front Department. Talk a little bit about what that is and what role it plays, most, I guess, especially towards South Korea, but towards us and others as well.
Yes, that department that you mentioned is tangentially related to this question, because it's a branch, an agency of the ruling North Korean Workers' Party, the Communist Party of Kim Jong un, which rules North Korea. And the United Front Department is tasked, and its agents are tasked with certain uh, activities within South Korea and also overseas in countries like the US to promote the interest of North Korea, to liaise with and to establish and to a certain extent control pro North Korean forces, groups and individuals, whether in South Korea, in the US, or in other countries. And they have agents posted abroad. For example, in the US, they have an agent posted at the North's UN mission, rather, United Nations mission, who is working with that United Front Department and who has been in contact with and is advising pro North Korean forces in the US, meeting with them, and that it is classified by the US government as an intelligence agency of the North.
An intelligence agency whose specific mission is influence operations and subversion, I guess it's fair to say. And to the extent that this legislation would not only give North Korea a pass on the many things it's doing that are so appalling and reprehensible and, well, frankly, incompatible with our interests and values and those of, I think, the people of South Korea as well. It obviously requires a considerable amount of influence being brought to bear to try to get members of Congress to give the North Korean government such a pass. Um, Before again we get into some of these people who are trying to help the North Koreans in this way, let me just ask you: there are some experts who have said that the practical effect of papering, shall we say, an end to the Korean War would be to give the Moon government in South Korea a pretext for doing what it seems very intent on doing, Lawrence Peck, which is essentially really basically winding down, if not ending, the U.S. alliance with South Korea, and most especially the presence on South Korean soil of U.S. forces that have been instrumental to trying to deter another invasion by the North Korean government of the South. Do you see it that way?
Yes, I do. To certainly to some aspect, because we talked about some of the North Korean agencies, which have been through their fellow travelers in the U.S. Pushing for, lobbying for this bill quite intensely, but also the South Korean government, the leftist government of Moon Jae-in, the current one, has been using forces which support it within the U.S. To push for this bill, in addition to pushing for it in its own right. So they're kind of double teaming us, and the theory and the fear, I should say, behind those of us like myself and you and others, such as North Korea human rights groups, which have come out against the bill, is that it kind of leads the way to, it paves the path to some other very dangerous scenarios, such as, for example, if peace is declared and if a peace treaty comes to pass, then the argument can be made, well, there's no longer need for U.S. sanctions on North Korea since we're at peace, and there's no longer need for a large presence of U.S. forces in Korea since we're now at peace, and there's no need for certain U.S. Defensive systems currently in place in South Korea, such as the THAAD anti-missile system, terminal high altitude area defense. So once this process is put into motion, then there will be a series, we fear, of follow-up demands, both and requests and policies put into place by the left in South Korea.
The cumulative effect would be, if that were all to eventuate, that the conditions on the ground in South Korea may once again be, well, tempting to say the least, if not irresistibly so, for a government in North Korea that has long aspired to reunite with the South on the North's terms through violent means. Are you concerned, Lawrence Peck, as a professional Korea watcher, that that would be exactly how the North Korean government of Kim Jong-un would respond were U.S. forces to be removed, were the U.S. South Korea alliance to be eroded or thrown over the side?
I think the main danger, both that this bill could lead to and about the more general appeasement, so-called engagement policies towards North Korea by particularly the leftist regime in South Korea and by some in our country, is not that it would tomorrow lead to a second Korean War or an outbreak of open hostilities on the peninsula, but that it would do a number of things. Number one, it would embolden North Korea, reward their bad behavior, legitimize them. Number two, it would create an opportunity for the North Koreans to increase their long term, their slow motion plan, to increase their ability to dominate, to impose their will on the South, to put the South in a position of inferiority in terms of its diplomatic status. And number three, it would increase the ability of the North Koreans to engage in other nefarious actions short of war. For example, if the sanctions were relaxed, it would gain them new foreign currency resources, which would enable them to increase the viability and the technical aspects of their nuclear program and of their shipment of WMDs and WMD related technology to other bad actors around the world, such as in the Middle East. So it would have a number of very negative effects for U.S. national security and for peace in the Northeast Asia region, even if it didn't result in all-out armed conflict.
Yeah. The problem, of course, is not only that we would be propping up thereby this odious and really despicable, repressive, totalitarian system in North Korea, but again, because of the proclivities of the Moon Jae-in government in South Korea, it well could conduce to reunification on the North's terms, even short of the violent invasion and conquest of South Korea. So, for all these reasons, this particular piece of legislation, H.R. 3446 is truly misbegotten and potentially very, very dangerous. So tell us a little bit about the people who have been promoting it, evidently with considerable success with Brad Sherman and many of the most radical leftists in the Congress of the United States.
This bill is being pushed just as the larger effort for appeasement of North Korea is being pushed here in the U.S. by a double team network of two formerly distinct movements, which have now combined and are making common cause to get behind this bill. And that is number one, the pro North Korean elements, organizations, and individuals in the U.S., individuals who, to varying degrees, and groups to varying degrees, who are in sympathy with, apologists for, in some cases, even openly support the North Korean regime, or at the very minimum defend it in its conflict with the U.S. and the West. And also, uh, those forces are in conjunction with pro Moon Jae-in forces, forces which support the leftist Democratic Party of Korea and its new nominee for president, who will be running in the 2022 elections, Lee Jae-myung, who, if anything, is even more radical both in terms of his domestic Korean economic policies and his foreign policies and his hostility to the US, Japan, South Korea alliance than Moon was. And these two forces have joined together, the pro South Korean left forces and the pro North Korean forces residing in the US, to lobby intensively for this bill.
So we have pro North Korean agents or agents of influence or um, those who are serving in similar roles working with people in the thrall of the radical leftists in South Korea and radical leftists in the United States, all to bring about something that is likely to result not in peace on the Korean Peninsula, but possibly the conquest of South Korea, the loss of freedom there, and maybe even another horrific Korean War 2.0. For all these reasons, Lawrence Peck, I think you would agree this is a very ill-advised operation, and I hope that it will not go forward. And more to the point, that we will not see the President of the United States responding favorably to the importuning by Brad Sherman and others to do through executive branch action what the Congress might otherwise try to do legislatively. You'll be following this closely. Lawrence Peck, I hope that you will come back to us with updates, as I know you are going to be keeping a close eye on all of this, and your warnings are very much needed and hopefully will be heeded. We'll talk with you again soon. We'll talk with the rest of you again, I hope, very soon as well. Until then, this is Frank Gaffney. Thanks so much for watching and listening.